Okay. Rowan, thank you so much for that reminder.
Sure. Anisha is asking if the slides will be shared.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes. It actually, if you could, in the chat box, if you could type, if you're comfortable typing your email address, we can take that down and then have a list of the group of us to share the slides. Okay, so my name is Brenda Tully, and I am a PhD student at UCLA. I am very much at the beginning of my dissertation proposal process, and I do not have my data yet. And so this was a very helpful exercise for me, just to kind of try to map a little more purposefully the life course perspective on my my research questions. So I'm looking at longitudinal housing insecurity among young adults formerly in foster care. And in my search for theory or a theoretical framework, I wanted to find something that would help me to look at micro questions, so person level data. I'm using quantitative data, so I needed something that would work for that. And I have some person level questions, which I'll show you in a second. I also have macro level questions, because when we're looking at housing outcomes of young people who are exiting care, there have been quite a few studies specifically around homelessness, not many studies that kind of go beyond that. There are starting to be a few, and I want to add to that. So I want to look at state and local context of young people's housing paths. And I also wanted to look at the person in the context and those interactions, and then change over time. So the life course perspective helps me in the following ways. So it's a theoretical perspective that accounts for the outcome under investigation, which is housing and changes in housing over time. And so this maps onto the life course concept of trajectories. So individuals have long-term patterns of stability and change that are not always linear, and there is variability in those trajectories within cohorts. So I'm looking at one group of young people from the time they're 17 until they're 26 years old. And obviously we expect that there's going to be differences among young people within that group. So the trajectory is the individual movement, and then the pathways are when groups of people move through. Next, on the micro level, I wanted to look at the associations between housing outcomes and biological family contact. In practice and in qualitative research, it's been documented that young people who exit care as young adults often return to biological family. And we don't have very much information about that. I did a study a couple years ago that's looking at using focus groups with young people who exit care, and a subset of them described going back to a biological family member, a parent or a sibling, and sharing housing with them. And so I wanted to look at that with this longitudinal data. And that speaks to the concept or the theme in the life course perspective of linked lives. So the interdependence of human relationships. So young people returning to biological family to share housing, how does that affect their trajectory moving into early adulthood? And next, I want to ask those macro questions about state and local contexts. So how are housing outcomes associated with local conditions? You know, things like employment rates, things like the data spans the Great Recession here in the US. So looking at, housing foreclosures and how that might affect rental properties. And then state conditions, the extended care policies are different in the 3 states that I'm looking at. So this speaks to the diversity in life course trajectories based on these conditions at the local and state level. And then I wanted to look at person-context interactions. So here in the US, there's well-documented research that shows that particularly people who are Black and LGBTQ people face discrimination in housing in the US. And in the rental housing, the process of finding rental housing is more time consuming for people who are Black and LGBTQ people because the rate at which they're shown available apartments is much lower than a white person walking in. So I wanted to look at that as well. How does a young person's identity kind of interact with the state and local conditions that we know are discriminatory? And so this is leading to the life course perspective theme is diversity within cohorts. So I have young people who are presenting with different identities, and given the, sorry, that's my reminder, and given their identities and discrimination together, how does that change their pathway? And that's it. And Yvonne, I'm going to make you the co-host now so you can share.
Oh, great. You can do that. I had Robbie set up to share my slides for me. So thanks, Robbie, for being my backup there. That's great. You're a very good example, Brenda, with your timer. I'm very impressed. I better set a timer.
It's just helpful for me to stay on task.
No, you're totally right. You're totally right.
Right. So you should be able to share now.
Perfect. Oh, amazing. Perfect. Thank you so much. So I'm really happy to see that we all got the use blue in your slides memo. So I'm just, is that okay? Can you see that? You can see that? Okay, perfect. I'll start my timer. Okay, so thanks to Brenda and Robbie for asking me to be a part of this discussion group, I suppose. So I'm going to talk about how I, kind of the value of the life course perspective as I see it from how I applied it to my PhD study, which I just finished at the end of last year. So, and it was also a qualitative study. So kind of, I suppose I would have probably been applying it in quite a different way, or maybe not, that's up for discussion, I suppose. Thinking about it maybe in a different way to Brenda, purely from the point of view of doing a qualitative study, but a lot of the main points remain the same, I think. So it'd be interesting to see what we think of that as a conversation. So I'm not going to share the findings of my PhD here today. If anyone wants to know about them, I'm very happy to share them. But really, I'm going to just give you a sense of what my PhD was trying to do, and then, the value of the life course perspective to helping me answer those questions. So the main thing I was trying to do was to explore educational pathways of care experienced adults in Ireland. Sorry, just one second. And I was examining what influenced and shaped those pathways over time. I have a small child beside me who's telling me that she can't hear, so I apologise. Buddy, then go downstairs, is that okay? No. So I was looking at the educational pathways of care experienced adults, and I was trying to get a sense of what influenced and shaped those pathways over time. And I used the life course perspective as a guiding research paradigm and a theoretical framework when I was doing that. The process of identifying it and using it and applying it as a guiding paradigm and a theoretical framework was not a straightforward one. It was quite a kind of messy process trying to figure out what that would look like. And if anyone has questions about that at the end, I'm very happy to speak a little bit more about that. Some of the reasons that I decided to use a life course perspective or apply a life course perspective to my study, it's probably worth mentioning that I didn't start out planning to use a life course perspective. It kind of emerged, or I identified it as a very relevant framework kind of maybe a few months into the study. So I think that's part of the process of figuring out your PhD in many ways. But as some of you might already be aware, the issue of education and care is one that it's not a straightforward issue. There's lots of various factors that have already been identified as impacting on the educational attainment and experiences of young people in care and care leavers. And that's also true in the literature for the general population, I suppose, as well. So that kind of complexity was one thing that I think I thought I need something with a few different dimensions, or that's something that takes that multidimensional perspective to try and figure out what's going on here. I also wanted to, or I also felt the life course perspective did a good job of capturing that passage of time piece that Robbie mentioned already. So the idea that what influences our education changes and shifts over time is something that the life course perspective allows you to capture. And again, then the emphasis being on development over time. Another key component. I should have mentioned at the beginning that I did educational life history interviews with the people that I spoke to. So I spoke with 18 care experienced adults who were aged 24 to 36. And I wanted to get a sense of their story, their educational story. So that methodology teamed with the life course perspective I felt was quite a good match. And another really important thing, I think, in the context of education generally, but specifically when you're talking about education and young people who've been in care, is that it does capture that ongoing potential for opportunities. So something that's really key to the life course perspective is that at every point, at every stage of our development, there's scope, there's potential, there's that kind of opportunities are kind of all the way along our trajectories. And I felt like that was quite an important idea to bring to a study like this. Again, then going back to the principles that Robbie mentioned, they're so relevant, I think, to the topic of education and care. Things like agency, the role of agency and how we shape our educational journeys, the role of other people in our educational journeys, and the notion that there's this diversity of trajectories in educational journeys. And it provided me with a framework for kind of digging in and disentangling how those principles applied and influenced the various people that I spoke to's educational pathways. I won't go into the nuts and bolts of how I applied it, but I essentially did theoretical thematic analysis. So I went in and used a deductive approach in my analysis, and I used some of the core concepts, agency and linked lives, in doing that. Also, just as a point of interest, I think the life course perspective has been applied to studies on education before, and a couple of studies in the context of care, but never to education and care as a combined topic, to the best of my knowledge. So I just thought it was worth mentioning that there, just as a point of information. So just a few quick reflections. I've got 45 seconds left, so I will try and make sure to cover all of these. At the end of my PhD, I felt like the life course perspective as a framework really helped to capture the experiences, or it provided me with a framework for capturing the experiences and the diversity of experiences of the young people that I spoke to, and it allowed me a way of digging into the complexity of their experience and highlighting the diversity of that experience as well. By applying some of those principles like linked lives and like agency, I was able to get a really in-depth look at the role and the impact that various actors or actions played over the course of people's educational pathway and their kind of educational timeline. It gives you this framework for looking at how, there's my timer now, this is my last slide. It gives you a framework for looking at how individual experiences take place within the context of structural and external factors. So that was very much central in the context of the analysis that I did in relation to agency, where you were able to see how individuals shape their own educational journey, but this was very much done within the structural context that they were living in at the time. It gives you this multidimensional lens, which Robbie has mentioned already as well, and that's particularly important when it comes to a topic like education and care, I think. And then again, just to come back to that final point, it reminds us that there is this ongoing potential for new beginnings and opportunities when it comes to education, and I think that's a really important message in the context of care generally, and also specifically in the context of education and care. So that is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much. And apologies for any background noise.
Thank you, Yvonne and Robbie. I think since our group is so small, we probably can just go ahead and converse. So if people have questions, feel free to ask them. I am going to, while people do that, put a couple of references in the chat, and we will also email those to you as well. So feel free to unmute yourself and speak.
I'm actually quiet because I'm thinking about, I'm trying to digest the presentations.
It's like speed dating. They go very quickly.
Maybe we. Well, I think we meant well in terms of trying to cover it very quickly, but we probably did compress an awful lot of information into a very short set of time, and it may be a lot to digest. So we're happy to answer questions. You know, if you want to sort of just go back to the beginning in terms of things we were saying, or in terms of, you know, really anything is.
I suppose I have a question for everyone in the group. Maybe if the life course perspective is for people who are here, so I suppose maybe not myself and Robbie and Brenda, but is the life course perspective something that you're kind of thinking about dabbling in using in your research, or is it something that's just you want to learn more about, or has anyone maybe done a piece of work drawing on the life course already that they're either in the middle of figuring out or they've already done? Just be interesting to hear maybe people's reasons for choosing this thematic group, I suppose.
Okay, I can start. So I'm interested. I mean, I was really interested in learning more about it, especially because I'm continuing to do waves of interviews of care leavers. So I just really wanted to, you know, learn more about it and to see how it's being applied in different countries and with different subgroups of care leavers. And I mean, one question that I would have is because the group of young people or adults now that I'm following up, I mean, there are subgroups. Some of them are parents now, some of them have divorced, some of them continued their master's degree. So I was just wondering how that perspective, and I'm sorry if this question is very naive, it's because I'm trying to learn more about it. How can it adapt to diverse subpopulations within one cohort? Does that make sense?
Yeah, well, the short answer is well, I think, but I'd bow to the other, my colleagues as well on that. I think it's the idea of having a cohort that has a clear membership, if you like. So your cohort was started off as one group, so that the fact that their pathway is diversified is, you know, that's what life course expects. I think the life course perspective expects that.
Yes, and I think Hutchinson in particular, of the references we provided, speaks to that. She talks about how initially in the studies that led to the development of the life course perspective, they looked at different birth cohorts, but more recently people are looking at diversity within one cohort. So it's a group of people who are experiencing, you know, very similar external conditions and contexts, but also, you know, their pathways go in different directions, or the transitions that they make in life happen at different times, you know, from school to work, or into parenthood, or into relationship, or out of relationship, that type of thing. So I think it would fit well.
Okay, thank you.
If I might ask a question, this is Anisha from India. Robbie, you took us, like you said, twice over, a real whistle-stop tour for us that are trying to learn more about just the framework of life course perspective. So if we have the time and you could pull up the diagram that you had right in the beginning, I don't mean to frighten you on the whole technology side of things, because I know it's easier said than done when we're not all together in a room. But the reason I was asking is I wanted to understand the trajectories and the pathways, because you said something very interesting about how pathways are different means towards trajectories. So I just wanted to understand that, because especially, and I'll ask in the perspective of COVID, where we've actually seen reverse pathways, if that's the way to use, where we've had our care leavers who are independent and have moved on and are now having to come back to institutional care in certain spaces because they have nowhere to go. So a reverse trajectory, as it were. So I just wanted to understand how we could apply an example like that to understand the trajectories and pathways principles.
Yeah. Sorry, just a technical problem. I don't quite know why that slide is not sitting in. Can you hear me?
Yes,
It's perfectly all right, and we can
see it.
It's sort of jumping back and forth between the diagram.
Anyway, well, I think the essential issue for the purposes of leaving care research with using life course is this point about having a cohort of people who share probably some kind of, you know, there's a frame around the group in terms, at the beginning, the researcher constitutes the group with reference to age and other characteristics, and then gathers data about those, maybe informed by life course ideas, and then analyzes the data, again informed by life course ideas. So if you have a cohort, I think diversity within the cohort experience is that's in a sense what life course perspective is trying to study. So in some ways it's a strength rather than a problem, I would say. And people going back, it's a very interesting pattern. So going back, in other words, that they haven't managed the supports in the, if I understand your point correctly, the supports in the wider community or the challenges in the wider community make it difficult for the young adults to manage without support. So they have to come back to the centres where they emerged from in the first place. But I mean, that is important data. So I don't think that renders the data ineligible for a life course analysis, but I'd be interested in the views of my colleagues on that.
Yeah, sorry, it's Ivan here. I'll just come in really quickly. Anisha, isn't it? Am I?
Yes, Anisha.
Yeah, hi.
Anisha, hi.
How are you? Nice to meet you. No, I just would agree.
Thank you for your presentation.
Yeah, of course, you're welcome. Thanks. It's lovely to have other life course interested groups here, people here, so it's nice to talk about it. I suppose just building on what Robbie said, like I think I totally agree that it's a really interesting kind of convergence of, you know, the individual and the kind of structural, the contextual factors, and how they're very much clearly intertwined in the case of COVID, you know, and the impact that has then on the person's pathway and wider trajectory and wider pathway. I think it sounds like that would be a really interesting piece of work to apply the life course perspective to, in one sense. Depending on how long you're going to follow the young people for, but I think that would be the main thing I would say, that it does highlight that the constraints, I suppose, within which individuals carry out their life and individual development takes place within. You know, the COVID experience is a very real example of how that plays out. So I think it sounds like a really interesting example of how the life course perspective might be applied, just from what I'm thinking here. I don't know if Brenda, if you have any additional.
I would just add, because I've been trying to sort of tease out the difference between the trajectory and the pathway as well. And my understanding is that the trajectory speaks to an individual's journey, and it can go any direction. So it could, you know, 2 steps forward, 3 steps back, 3 steps, you know, it can move in any kind of non-linear direction for a trajectory. And then the pathways are when you have groups of people and you're pooling their trajectories. And then that gives us information about pathways that groups of young people are experiencing or have experienced. And then we can look at differences across those groups, not just individual young people, but also the groups who are experiencing similar trajectories. Does that make sense?
It does to me, but somehow I thought Robbie was looking at it differently. So I don't know. Robbie?
Yeah, well, I think there may be, depending, I think one of the issues is the window of time that you're using. In other words, how long the window of time extends. So if you're using data that really refers to the experience of people between, just say, 18 and 25 years of age, are you looking back? In other words, are you interviewing them at 25, looking back to their story from 18? Or is the data design, the study design that you're tracking them from 18 to 25?
Right.
Or is the window 18? I mean, in Ivan's study, there were young people, young adults from their early 20s to beyond. 36 was the eldest, was it, Ivan? Yeah, so that's a much longer window potentially within the cohort to sort of review. So in a long window, there may be different shifts, or so I think in another pathway may be used possibly in a different sense when the window of time you're studying or reviewing the data extends over a very long time. I mean, in principle, a life course study could be from 20 to 60 or 20 to 50, the data. Now, but it is, theoretically it's possible you could interview somebody at 50 and ask them to kind of tell their story from when they left school or something like that. And in that, you and they may identify certain significant shifts in the journey, where different trajectories begin and end, and in a sense that might be those different trajectories combined in a different sense of combination may be seen as a pathway for that individual. But I think Brenda's point, is another way of thinking about that in terms of cross group comparisons or within group comparisons. So sorry, it's maybe not maybe not crystal clear, but I think it does. It also has a bearing on whether you're looking at the quantitative data or qualitative data. In qualitative data, you're looking at probably much more at individual journeys, and you're comparing features of those journeys across the cases. In quantitative data, you're in some ways the issues are the same, but at the same time, you may have access to data allowing you to look at a number of cohorts, your own cohort, but it may be data from other cohorts that are relevant. I'm straying outside my expertise here, Brenda.
Can I just add something on that point about the quantitative, because I found, and Brenda, it'd be interesting to hear what you think, but I found when I was figuring out if and how I would use the life course perspective, there's actually so much of the literature is based on quantitative studies that draw on large scale data sets, and there's a lot less, I found anyway, that applies it to qualitative data. And I also found in a lot of the papers that I read, and this is not a criticism of those people who wrote them, but it was often very difficult to figure out how it was actually applied beyond kind of being a general, a lens that one uses. And I found I had to spend a lot of time reading and digging and clarifying, and some of the terminology even is used in different ways as well. So I kind of came out the other side with my own understanding and my own decisions around how I was going to apply it. And maybe that's the same with lots of different frameworks, but it's applied in so many different ways as a methodology, as a research paradigm, as a theoretical framework. Like, it's written about in a lot of different ways. So I feel like if it feels a bit confusing and it feels a bit overwhelming, then in one sense that's kind of the right way to be about it. And I certainly found I spent a lot of time walking through the trees, walking through the forest. I don't know, Brenda, if that's your experience of it as well. Some things are really clear about it, but then some things aren't, which is quite nice in one sense, because it gives you a bit of, you know, freedom to make decisions and that kind of stuff, which takes confidence that you don't always have when you're in the middle of your PhD thinking, what am I doing? But in a way, it's so big and it's so broad, and yet there are specific things about it. But I suppose just to say that was my experience anyway, that it was tricky kind of figuring out what it would look like to take a life course perspective. So I don't know, not to take things off in a totally different direction, but I think it's kind of relevant to what you've just been saying there, Anisha and Robbie. I don't know, Brenda, is that your sense of it, or maybe you're just much better at grasping things than I am?
No, that actually is really helpful to hear, because I've read different of the like kind of like the source people, and I'm like, but wait a minute, I think that they're talking about this a little differently. So yes, thank you for sharing that, Yvonne. You're
very welcome.
Helps me not feel like I'm not understanding.
No, yeah. And I think it's really important, and I don't know, I've never kind of engaged with a framework or a kind of a body of work and a theory as much as I have with life course perspective. Maybe that happens with other theories when you start to dig down as well, but I am also reassured to know that that's been your experience. It works both ways.
Yeah.
Another point to bear in mind is, you know, that it's kind of a big church or a big tent. It's in conceptual or intellectual terms. I think it doesn't have a very strict theology, if I might use that metaphor. So it's very liberal, I would say, and it doesn't have a manual. You know, it in a sense, I think if you're inside the tent, you are informed by the work of other people who are in the same tent, but you really have to, in some ways, figure out, you know, each study, in some ways, because it's so accommodating, it's almost impossible to have a manual, because it itself attracts such diversity of approaches within a broad framework. So that, I think, puts a burden on each researcher or team of researchers to kind of work out their own salvation to some extent, while still trying to remain consistent with the key features or principles. I don't know if that's of any consolation to you, but it probably is a bit worrying for some people who've been reared on very strict regimes and compliance with manuals and so on. You know, that's not to criticize that, but I think that the life course perspective is a kind of a different tradition of research, I think. Remember, he was a sociologist. But, you know, maybe, I don't mean there aren't sociologists out there who would follow, who kind of revel in strict regimes, but maybe they're a more diverse group. Sociologists make up a diverse group themselves.
And Anisha, with your question related to COVID, you know, I guess, what are your thoughts about, you know, trying to document what's happening, what you're seeing?
Actually, like I said, you know, I come from a practitioner perspective and not a researcher, so I'm putting that out there. But that's part of the reason why I chose to come to this group, because it was a learning for me. And especially when I saw Robbie's presentation, the slide that you're seeing, and then the pathways that, well, sorry for using that word, but the pathways, I don't mean to traumatize the both of you, but the pathways that Brenda and Evan have taken, you know, what it was just making me see is that we're looking at the different perspectives on COVID at the moment. And when I saw these words, bidirectional, multidimensional, flexible, it really sort of popped out at me from the COVID perspective of the lived experiences that we are dealing with across cohorts and we have very different geographies, and COVID has affected the different geographies very differently in terms of how hard it's hit, how it's affected the care levers that we are working with across different, like you just said, you know, there was that cohort that you're trying to create, yes, it's easy to say it's care leavers, so it makes it a nice little tent, Robbie, as it were. But within that tent, there are so many different nuances that I just felt that what you were explaining to us at the start really lends itself very beautifully. Perhaps I need to think this through, because the experience itself is so new. It's virtually like a re-traumatization that's happened for many of the youth that we are working with, because they had gotten along their trajectory, and we've been studying them for 8 years now. We're doing a study with Duke University that is longitudinal and in its 8th year. And we've brought in the COVID perspective over the summer, but we're still not sure about how to address it. So the life course perspective allows me to, from whatever little I've understood, and I will read more, is allowing me to put that liberal, not theological framework to it. But to be able to look at it differently, because mostly all the pathways that one looks at, or the trajectories or the theories one studies, really have that, step 1, step 2, step 3, step 4. And COVID has upended that entire perspective. So I think life course perspective might be an interesting way to look at the COVID experience because of the fact that it takes you back and has done at least the beginning of, like I said, unfortunately, the re-traumatization that I'm seeing amongst the different domains that we are, the 8 domains that we sort of take. Even identity is in question today, because you reached a certain place or an identity at 25 in terms of your workplace or the education that you had, and suddenly it's rendered completely useless, in as much as the only definition you have is that of a care leaver, which allows you to get the care or just food on the table, is because you're a care leaver. So that's become your definition again. And you've moved out from a tent of being a business process outsourcer or student of master studies, to use some of the examples that you did. That's where I was coming from. So very exploratory at the moment, but very interesting because of these words that are popping out at me when I understood from the work that you have done, that, this gives you that, exactly what you said, stretch that perspective to see it differently from being a necessary pathway, but
so
actually going backwards.
Sorry, Anisha, but if I understand you correctly, you have data, there's a cohort for whom you have data for 8 years, and they're the people who are affected now by COVID.
Correct.
Okay.
You're right.
I mean, that's very exciting that you've got that passage of time, that window of time of 8 years. I mean, the one thought I would offer is the further you can extend the data collection into the COVID and post, and hopefully eventually post-COVID experience, probably the better from the point of view of trying to understand the impact of COVID and the adjustments, which are really important and interesting, I think, from the point of view of the research, to not only know about what does COVID do to the people, but what do the people, in a sense, do in response to COVID as well. Right. And I know that you're saying they're highly constrained by economic and social realities, but nevertheless, but it's just a thought. I mean, that's a really interesting opportunity you have to track the group through at least some of the COVID period, because we don't know how long it's going to extend in some ways, do we?
We have just like 3 minutes left, just to throw that out to the group. And go ahead, Robbie.
No, I was going to say, is anyone else wanting to, is there anyone else who'd like to contribute, or, sorry, go on, Brenda.
I apologize for hogging all of the learning time, but Rawan, please.
It was very interesting and very helpful. I'm just wondering how we can get a copy of the chat so that we can get the references that you shared with us. Or
yes.
Maybe when we send the slides, just include it as another attachment. Okay. Is that okay?
Yeah, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, we'll do
Rawan,
that.
it's also just easy to copy paste the whole thing. That's what I did.
Yeah.
Pull up that on your screen and just highlight the whole thing and copy paste it into a Word file on your computer, and you're done.
Thank you.
Also, I wanted to just mention to you, Anisha, and then to anybody else too, who's looking at health. The life course perspective has been applied to health studies, mental health and physical health, a lot. And there are a couple of articles that I can add to the list that I think you might find very helpful. So I will do that.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Mhm.
Thank you.
I'd like to thank you for this view, for your research. I'm not a researcher, but for me it's really important, your results for implementation to the practice. So thank you very, very much for your work. It's very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Natasha, for being here.
Okay, it's not letting me copy. So Anisha, I mean, I guess you'll be sharing it. You'll be sharing the references with us.
Yes, we'll share the references and the slides.
Okay,
I just took down your new email address there, around, so I have that in the list. And I'm just going to put the link to get back into the general meeting in the chat now as well for everybody, just because I know I would be looking for the PDF, and I figured let's make life easier for everybody. So that's what's coming up there. So hopefully I have the right link. So anyway, just to say that.
Thank you for doing that, Yvonne.
No problem. And thanks to Robbie and Brenda for
good luck with your PhD, Brenda.
facilitating. Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you very
And
much.
good luck.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks,
Thank
bye.
you.
Thank
See
you
ya.
so much. It was a real learning for me. Thank you so
It
much.
was really helpful, Anisha, to hear you describe what you're seeing as well. So helpful. And, you know, obviously my heart is with, you know, all of the young people, because it's an unprecedented experience.
Truly, truly it has been.
Mhm.
But thank you. Thank you.
Thank
It's
you.
been wonderful. And I hope that we're able to keep in touch.
Yes.
That'd be
Yeah.
great.
So thank you for that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
See you back on the other side.
Yes.
Thanks very much. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.